Once upon a time, Richard Johnson stared out the airplane window as the sprawling city of Lagos came into view. The golden rays of the morning sun reflected off the high-rise buildings, and he could already feel the warm air pressing against the glass. He leaned back in his seat, sighing. He loved his father but couldn't understand why. Chief Johnson had insisted he return to Nigeria for his university education. "You need to know where you come from," his father had said over a call just 2 weeks earlier. "You've spent your entire life abroad, disconnected from your people and culture. That ends now. You'll be attending a university here in Lagos." Richard had protested, but the conversation was one-sided. Chief Johnson was a man who believed that money, discipline, and tradition were the pillars of success. He always got his way. Now, seated in the back of the family's black Mercedes, Richard felt the weight of this new chapter of his life. The driver expertly navigated the chaotic Lagos traffic, honking and dodging motorcycles as Richard scrolled through his phone. His friends in London had been sending him messages all morning. "Mate, you're going to hate it there. No parties, no fun." "Nigeria? Really?" He smirked but didn't respond. As they pulled into the gates of the university, Richard's attention shifted to the vibrant atmosphere. Students walked in groups, laughing, debating, and some even selling goods to make extra cash. The campus wasn't as modern as the schools he'd attended abroad, but it had a charm that was hard to ignore. "Young master, we're here," the driver announced, parking in front of the administrative building. Richard stepped out, his designer sneakers landing on the dusty ground. Heads turned as he walked toward the building. His sharp suit and aura of wealth stood out like a sore thumb. "Who's that?" someone whispered. "Definitely one of those rich kids," another replied. Richard ignored the murmurs, entering the building to finalize his registration. He couldn't help but feel like an outsider. Later that day, Richard decided to explore the campus. Despite his initial reluctance, he was curious about this new environment. As he strolled through the school grounds, something caught his eye, or rather someone. Under a large mango tree, a young woman sat with her legs crossed, completely engrossed in a textbook. Her dark skin glowed in the afternoon sun, and her natural curls framed her delicate face perfectly. She wore a simple but well-fitted dress, and her demeanor exuded confidence. Richard paused, observing her from a distance. She seemed unfazed by the world around her, her lips moving slightly as she read. "Who's that?" he asked a passing student. The student, a guy wearing a hoodie, glanced over. "That's Sarah Williams. She's the smartest student in the school. Got a full scholarship. But trust me, don't even think about it." "Think about what?" Richard asked, his interest piqued. Trying to talk to her, the student replied with a chuckle. "She doesn't mix with people like us, or like you, for that matter." Richard frowned. "People like me? Rich kids," the guy explained. "Sarah doesn't care about money or status. She's all about her studies and building a better future for herself." Richard smiled faintly. A challenge. He loved challenges. The next day, Richard found himself in the library, pretending to look for a book while keeping an eye on Sarah. She was seated at a corner table, surrounded by notebooks and a large bottle of water. He hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Hi," he said, his voice unusually soft. Sarah didn't look up. "Do you need something?" I just thought you might need help," he stammered. "With what?" she asked, still not lifting her gaze. "Studying?" Finally, Sarah looked up, her sharp brown eyes meeting his. There was a hint of annoyance in her expression. "I don't need help. Especially not from someone who doesn't know what he's doing in a library." Richard opened his mouth to respond but found himself speechless. He was used to girls fawning over him, but Sarah's confidence and clear disinterest caught him off guard. Embarrassed, he muttered an apology and walked away. Over the next week, Richard couldn't get Sarah out of his mind. He noticed her everywhere, in class, at the cafeteria, and even at school events. She was always focused, always poised. The more he observed her, the more he admired her determination and intelligence. One afternoon, he decided to approach her again. This time, he was prepared. "Hi, Sarah," he said as she exited the lecture hall. She stopped, clearly surprised that he knew her name. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," Richard said with a charming smile. "I'm Richard Johnson. I've noticed you around, and I thought I'd introduce myself. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And why would I need to know you? Richard laughed. Fair point. But I'd really like to get to know you. Maybe we could have lunch sometime? No. Thank you, she replied bluntly. I don't have time for distractions. As she walked away, Richard couldn't help but grin. The challenge had just begun. Determined to win her over, Richard started finding small ways to help. Sarah, he'd leave snacks on her desk in class or quietly pay for her meals at the cafeteria. At first, Sarah was suspicious of his motives, but over time, she began to see his sincerity. One day, she confronted him. Why are you doing all this? Because I like you, Richard admitted, and I think you're incredible. Sarah sighed. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to smile. By the end of the semester, Richard and Sarah had grown close. Despite her initial reservations, Sarah found herself falling for him. He wasn't just a spoiled rich kid, he was kind, thoughtful, and determined to prove his love. Sarah had always kept her distance from people like Richard. The rich, carefree kids on campus had no idea what it meant to struggle, and she didn't want their pity. But Richard wasn't like the others. He wasn't arrogant or dismissive, and despite his playful nature, he seemed genuinely interested in her. At first, Sarah thought his persistence was a game. Every day, he would find some excuse to talk to her, whether it was about borrowing a pen or asking for help with an assignment he clearly didn't need assistance with. Slowly, his light-hearted charm began to wear down her defenses. One rainy afternoon, Sarah sat alone in the library, lost in her books. She didn't notice Richard standing nearby until he gently placed a coffee cup on the table in front of her. You looked like you could use this, he said, flashing her his boyish grin. Sarah looked up, startled. You didn't have to. I wanted to, he interrupted, sitting across from her. You're always working so hard, Sarah. Don't you ever take a break? I don't have the luxury of breaks, she replied, taking a cautious sip of the coffee. Some of us can't afford to waste time. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. You know, you make it really hard for a guy to get close to you. Sarah sighed, setting her cup down. Why are you so interested in me, Richard? We're nothing alike. Maybe that's why I like you, he said simply. You're different. You're smart, hardworking, and you don't care about impressing anyone. I've never met anyone like you before. His words caught her off guard, and for the first time, Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Their first real date was unplanned. One evening, after a particularly grueling lecture, Richard waited for Sarah outside the classroom. Let me take you somewhere, he said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. I have to study, she protested, though a small part of her was tempted. Just 1 hour, he pleaded. I promise it'll be worth it. Against her better judgment, she agreed. Richard drove them to a small, cozy restaurant on the edge of town. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but the food was delicious, and the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Over dinner, they talked about everything: her childhood, his life abroad, their dreams for the future. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in years, and by the end of the night, she realized she didn't want it to end. As Richard walked her back to her dorm, he stopped suddenly, turning to face her. Sarah, he said softly, I know you're scared, and I know you think this won't work, but I want you to know that I'm serious about you. I don't care about the differences between us. I just want to be with you. Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. The kiss was gentle at first, but it quickly deepened, sending a wave of heat through her body. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to let go. Their relationship grew quickly after that night. Richard was attentive and caring, always finding ways to make Sarah feel special. He would surprise her with small gifts: flowers, chocolates, even handwritten notes tucked into her books. Sarah tried to resist, but it was impossible not to fall for him. One night, as they lay together in Richard's apartment, Sarah traced lazy circles on his chest. You know this won't be easy, she murmured, her voice heavy with doubt. I don't care, he said, pulling her closer. You're worth it. Their intimacy deepened over time, both emotionally and physically. Sarah had never felt so vulnerable yet so safe with anyone before. Richard treated her like she was the most important person in the world, and for the first time, She began to believe that maybe she deserved to be loved. Their nights together were filled with passion and tenderness. Richard was attentive to her every need, and Sarah found herself opening up to him in ways she never thought possible. Their connection was more than physical, it was a meeting of souls, a bond that felt unbreakable. But Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that their happiness was temporary. She knew how Richard's family would react if they found out about her, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to face their judgment. One weekend, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Richard brought up the idea of introducing Sarah to his family. "They'll love you," he said confidently. Sarah laughed bitterly. "Richard, your family is never going to accept someone like me." "Then I don't need them," he said firmly. "I only need you." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She knew the world they lived in, and she knew how quickly love could turn into pain. Still, she couldn't bring herself to walk away from him. "I'll think about it," she said finally, though her heart was heavy with doubt. Richard was persistent. Over the following weeks, he brought up the idea of Sarah meeting his family every chance he got. He couldn't understand her hesitation. In his mind, their love was enough to conquer any obstacle. But for Sarah, the stakes were higher. She had lived her entire life walking a tightrope, and the thought of stepping into Richard's world was terrifying. "Richard, you don't get it," Sarah said one evening as they sat together on the couch in his apartment. "Your family, they're not like you. They won't see me the way you do." "Sarah," Richard said, taking her hands in his, "my family doesn't control me. I love you, and that's all that matters. I want them to see the amazing person I've fallen for." "But what if they don't?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Then it's their loss," he replied firmly. Their relationship continued to blossom, but the shadow of Richard's family loomed over them. Sarah tried to push her fears aside, focusing instead on the moments they shared. One weekend, Richard surprised her with a trip to a quiet beach outside the city. The two of them spent the day laughing, playing in the water, and stealing kisses under the setting sun. As they sat on the sand, watching the waves crash against the shore, Richard turned to her with a serious expression. "Sarah," he said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Her heart raced at his words. "Richard, don't say things like that unless you mean them." "I do mean it," he said, pulling her closer. "I've never been sure of anything in my life." For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to dream of a future with him. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The day Richard finally convinced Sarah to meet his family was a mix of excitement and dread. He assured her that everything would be fine. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a lion's den. The Johnson estate was even more intimidating than she had imagined. The massive gates, sprawling gardens, and luxurious mansion were a stark reminder of just how different their lives were. "Relax," Richard whispered, squeezing her hand as they walked up the driveway. "They're going to love you." Sarah forced a smile, but her heart was pounding. Inside, the house was bustling with activity. Richard's mother, a graceful woman with a warm smile, greeted them at the door. "Richard," she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug. "It's so good to have you home." "Mom, this is Sarah," Richard said, turning to her with pride. "It's lovely to meet you, Sarah," his mother said, extending her hand. Sarah shook it nervously. "Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to be here." "Come in, come in," Richard's mother said, ushering them into the living room. The other members of the family were less welcoming. Richard's father, Chief Johnson, sat in an armchair, his sharp eyes scrutinizing Sarah as she entered. His younger sister, Amanda, barely acknowledged her, too busy scrolling through her phone. Richard introduced Sarah to everyone, his tone filled with affection and pride. But Sarah could feel the tension in the room. As the evening wore on, Chief Johnson called Sarah aside under the guise of wanting to get to know her better. "So, Sarah," he began, his tone polite but cold, "tell me about yourself." Sarah hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Well, sir, I'm studying economics on a scholarship. I work part-time to support my family, and I'm hoping to build a better future for us." Chief Johnson raised an eyebrow. "And what does your family do?" "My mother is a seamstress," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I see," he said, his expression hardening. "And your father?" "He passed away when I was a child," she replied quietly. Chief Johnson nodded slowly, his gaze piercing. You seem like a smart girl, Sarah. So let me be honest with you. My son comes from a family with a reputation to uphold. Connections, status, and wealth are important in our world. I don't mean to offend, but do you really believe someone like you belongs in it? Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she refused to back down. With all due respect, sir, I don't believe love should be defined by wealth or status. Chief Johnson chuckled humorlessly. That's a nice sentiment, but it's not how the real world works. If you care about my son, you'll do what's best for him and end this relationship before it goes any further. Tears stung Sarah's eyes, but she held her ground. I think Richard should decide what's best for him. Chief Johnson's expression darkened. Consider this a warning, Sarah. Walk away while you still can. When Sarah rejoined Richard, he immediately noticed her pale face. What happened? He asked, concern lacing his voice. Nothing, she said, forcing a smile. Let's just go. Richard frowned but didn't press her. As they left the estate, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their love story was about to face its biggest challenge yet. The drive back to the city was heavy with silence. Sarah stared out the window, her mind racing with Chief Johnson's words. She wanted to believe in Richard's love, but her fears were louder. Would their relationship survive the scrutiny and hostility of his family? Richard kept glancing at her, sensing the storm brewing inside her. Finally, he pulled the car over to the side of the road. Sarah, he said gently, turning to face her. What's wrong? Please talk to me. She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Your father doesn't think I'm good enough for you. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not surprised. My dad has always been obsessed with status. But his opinion doesn't matter, Sarah. What matters is us. But it's not that simple, she said, her voice breaking. You come from a world I'll never belong to, Richard. I don't want to be the reason you lose your family. You're not the reason, he said firmly, taking her hand. They're the ones who need to change, not us. I love you, Sarah, and I'm not going to let anyone come between us. His words were like a balm to her wounded heart, but the doubt lingered. The next few weeks were a test of their relationship. Richard became more attentive than ever, determined to show Sarah that his love for her was unshakable. He took her on late-night drives, cooked her dinner in his apartment, and left her sweet notes in her textbooks. One evening, as they lay in bed, Richard traced lazy circles on her bare back. You know, he said, his voice low and teasing, you're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Sarah chuckled, resting her head on his chest. You're not exactly easy to deal with yourself. I guess we're a perfect match then, he said, tilting her chin up to kiss her. Their nights together were a sanctuary from the outside world. In those moments, nothing else mattered, just the feel of his skin against hers, the sound of his heartbeat, and the way he looked at her like she was his entire world. But as much as she tried to lose herself in their love, Sarah couldn't ignore the growing tension with his family. The breaking point came one afternoon when Richard's father called him. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she overheard the conversation. Richard, Chief Johnson said, his tone sharp, I've been patient, but this has gone on long enough. That girl is not suitable for you. With all due respect, Dad, Richard replied, his voice cold. You don't get to decide who I love. This isn't about love, his father snapped. It's about your future. You need someone who can elevate our family, not drag it down. Sarah's hands trembled as she listened, tears welling in her eyes. I don't care about any of that, Richard said. I care about Sarah. If you can't accept that, then maybe I don't belong in this family. There was a long pause before Chief Johnson spoke again. You're making a mistake, Richard. And when it all falls apart, don't come running to me. When Richard hung up, Sarah walked into the living room, her face pale. Richard, she said softly, you can't keep fighting with your family because of me. I'm not fighting because of you, he said, pulling her into his arms. I'm fighting for us, but it's tearing you apart, she whispered. Maybe your father is right. Maybe I'm not good enough for you. Don't say that, he said fiercely, cupping her face in his hands. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Sarah, and I'm not going to lose you. Despite his defiance, Richard couldn't ignore the growing strain between him and his father. He decided to take a drastic step to prove his commitment to Sarah. One evening, he packed a bag and showed up at her doorstep. What are you doing here? She asked, shocked. I'm staying with you, "Till the holiday is over," he said simply. "Richard, no," she protested. "You can't just leave your family." "I can and I will," he said, stepping inside. "All I want is to be with you, Sarah. If my family can't accept that, then I don't need them." Sarah was torn. She wanted nothing more than to be with Richard, but she knew the consequences of his decision would be far-reaching. "Richard, please," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to go home." "I'm not going anywhere," he said stubbornly. The situation came to a head when Chief Johnson showed up at Sarah's apartment a week later. He was accompanied by two of his men, their presence intimidating. "Richard," his father said coldly, "it's time to come home." "I'm not going anywhere," Richard replied, standing protectively in front of Sarah. Chief Johnson turned to Sarah, his expression calculating. "Miss Sarah, I'm willing to make you an offer. 50 million naira. Take the money and leave my son for good." Sarah's heart sank. She glanced at Richard, who looked furious. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "Think carefully," Chief Johnson said, his tone threatening. "This is your chance to secure your future. Don't let pride get in the way." Sarah hesitated, a plan forming in her mind. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll take the money, but I need to say goodbye to Richard first." Richard's eyes widened in shock. "Sarah, no. Trust me," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Chief Johnson smirked, clearly satisfied. "Good. My men will transfer the money to your account immediately." As soon as the transaction was complete, Sarah pulled Richard aside. "We're taking the money and leaving," she said urgently. Richard stared at her, stunned. "What?" "We can use the money to start over," she explained. "Your father thinks I'm just another gold digger, so let's prove him wrong. We'll leave the city and build a life together." Richard hesitated, but the determination in Sarah's eyes convinced him. "Okay," he said finally, "let's do it." By the end of the week, their plan was in motion. The weeks leading up to graduation were filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Sarah and Richard kept their relationship low-key, avoiding public displays of affection or anything that might draw attention to them. Their bond remained as strong as ever, but they knew the stakes were higher now. One quiet evening, as they lay curled up in Sarah's small apartment, she turned to Richard with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He sat up immediately, concern etched on his face. "What is it, Sarah? Is everything okay?" She hesitated, searching his eyes. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air for a moment before a slow smile spread across Richard's face. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and joy. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't plan for this, but..." He cut her off with a kiss. "This is amazing news, Sarah. I couldn't be happier." "But your father," she began, worry creeping into her voice. "I don't care what he thinks," Richard said firmly. "This is our baby, our family. Nothing else matters." Unbeknownst to Sarah and Richard, Richard's father had not given up. After offering her the 50 million naira, when he had visited her apartment under the guise of checking on his son. While there, he subtly planted a small recording device in her bedroom, determined to uncover the truth about their plans. Late one night, as Sarah and Richard discussed their future, the recorder captured every word. "We'll leave after graduation," Richard said. "I've already secured the tickets and the car. No one will know where we're going." "And the money?" Sarah asked hesitantly. "It's our safety net," Richard reassured her. "We'll use it to start a new life." The recording confirmed the father's worst fears. Graduation day arrived, and the couple maintained their low profile. They avoided the after-parties and celebrations, opting instead to spend the evening in the privacy of Sarah's apartment. It was a bittersweet moment. While they were thrilled to have reached this milestone, they couldn't fully enjoy it knowing the challenges ahead. That night, as they lay in bed, Richard held Sarah close. "Tomorrow is the beginning of our new life," he whispered. Sarah nodded, resting her head against his chest. "I just hope we make it out of here without any problems." The next morning, they packed their belongings into Richard's car. Their plan was simple: leave the city before anyone noticed. They drove cautiously, sticking to less traveled roads, but they didn't know that Richard's father had sent men after them, armed with the recording and strict orders to stop them at all costs. As they drove down a quiet, lonely road on the outskirts of the city, a black SUV appeared behind them, speeding up to overtake their car. "Richard, something's not right," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. Before he could respond, the SUV swerved in front of them, forcing Richard to slam on the brakes. Four men stepped out, guns in hand. Richard's protective instincts kicked in. "Stay behind me," he told Sarah firmly as he exited the car. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. One of the men sneered. "Your father sent us. He said the girl needs to go." The moment the gun was raised towards Sarah, Richard didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, shielding her with his body. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the air. Richard collapsed against Sarah, blood seeping through his shirt. She screamed, holding him as the men, realizing their mistake, scrambled back into the SUV and sped off. "Help! Somebody help us!" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. A passing bus pulled over, and a man jumped out to assist. Together, they carried Richard into the vehicle and rushed him to the nearest hospital. The hospital lobby was chaotic, filled with the murmurs of worried families and the frantic movements of medical staff. Sarah sat on the edge of a hard plastic chair, her hands trembling and her clothes stained with Richard's blood. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for news about his condition. "Please, let him be okay," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. The emergency room doors finally swung open, and a doctor emerged. Sarah bolted to her feet. "He's stable," the doctor said. "The bullet missed his vital organs, but he lost a lot of blood. We managed to remove it, and he's resting now. You can see him soon." Relief flooded her, and she sank back into her seat, tears streaming down her face. Richard's father stormed into the hospital not long after, flanked by two of his personal guards. His face was a mixture of fury and panic. Sarah stood as he approached, her hands clenched into fists. "This is all your fault," he spat, his voice low but venomous. Sarah glared at him, her exhaustion giving way to anger. "My fault? You sent men after us. They were supposed to kill me, but they shot your son instead." His face paled at her words. He glanced around nervously before pulling her aside. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Sarah's voice rose, but she quickly controlled herself. "Your mistake almost cost your son his life." Before he could respond, Sarah shoved Richard's phone into his hand. "Listen to this." She played back the recording she had made on her phone. When Richard collapsed in her arms, calling out for help and saying he loved her. Richard's father listened, his expression softening as the weight of his actions hit him. Hours later, when Richard finally opened his eyes, his father was sitting by his bedside. The older man looked frail, his usual commanding presence diminished by guilt. "Dad?" Richard croaked, his voice weak. "I'm here, son," his father said, leaning closer. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong about Sarah, about everything. I thought I was protecting you, but all I've done is push you away." Richard's gaze was piercing despite his weakened state. "You almost got her killed. You almost got me killed." "I know," his father admitted, his voice trembling, "and I will regret it for the rest of my life. I'm done fighting you, Richard. If Sarah is who you want, then you have my blessing." Richard stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You need to tell her that." Later that evening, Richard's father found Sarah in the hospital cafeteria. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I owe you an apology," he began, his tone uncharacteristically humble. "I've been blind, selfish, and cruel. I only wanted what I thought was best for my son, but I see now that I was wrong. You make him happy, and that's all that matters." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, but this doesn't erase what you've done. You'll have to work hard to earn our trust." "I will," he promised. "I've already cut ties with the men I hired, and if there's anything else I can do to make amends, just tell me." The following day, Richard was well enough to sit up in bed. Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand. "You scared me," she admitted, her voice soft. "I'm sorry," he said, squeezing her hand, "but I'd do it again if it meant keeping you safe." A small smile played on her lips. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe," he replied, reaching into the drawer beside him. "But I'm also serious about this." He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "Sarah, I don't want to wait anymore. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Richard. Yes. When Richard was discharged from the hospital, his father invited them both to the family estate. This time, the atmosphere was different. The servants greeted Sarah with warmth, and Richard's mother embraced her, apologizing for not standing up for her sooner. During dinner, Richard's father stood to make a toast. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass, and to love that conquers all. The days following Richard's recovery were filled with a sense of renewed hope and cautious optimism. The family dynamics had shifted drastically, with Richard's father making genuine efforts to mend the broken bonds. Sarah, though still guarded, began to see glimpses of sincerity in the older man's actions. With Richard's father's blessing now secured, the couple wasted no time in planning their future. Sarah, ever practical, suggested a small, intimate wedding. But Richard's mother had other ideas. "You're the only son of this family," she insisted, her eyes alight with excitement. "Your wedding must be grand, a celebration worthy of your love." Richard chuckled, glancing at Sarah. "What do you think? Can you handle a big IGBO wedding?" Sarah smiled, her nerves evident. "As long as I'm with you, I can handle anything." The preparations began in earnest, with the family estate bustling with activity. Sarah's mother were brought to the city to be part of the celebrations, and she couldn't hide their pride and joy at their daughter's journey. On the eve of the wedding, Richard's father called Sarah aside. They stood in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns casting a warm light over the scene. "I owe you something," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Not just an apology, but my gratitude. You've shown me what true love looks like. You've made my son a better man, and for that, I will always be thankful." Sarah, touched by his words, nodded. "Thank you, sir. I hope we can move forward from here." He reached into his pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. "This is for you, a small gesture to show my support for your future." Unfolding it, Sarah's eyes widened. It was the deed to a house in the city. "I want you and Richard to start your life together in a place that's truly yours," he said. Sarah, overwhelmed, could only whisper, "Thank you." The wedding day dawned bright and clear, with a flurry of activities in both the family estate and the church where the ceremony was to take place. Sarah looked stunning in her gown, her radiant smile lighting up the room. Richard, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. "You're beautiful," he whispered when they stood face to face. "And you're mine," she replied with a grin. The ceremony was a blend of tradition and modernity, with prayers, vows, and blessings exchanged in front of family and friends. The reception was a joyous affair, filled with music, dancing, and heartfelt speeches. As newlyweds, Richard and Sarah began their life together in the home his father had gifted them. They decided to invest the remaining money from the 50 million naira into starting a foundation aimed at helping underprivileged students gain access to education, a cause close to Sarah's heart. Months later, their family grew as they welcomed a healthy baby boy. They named him Johnson, after Richard's father, a gesture that brought tears to the older man's eyes. During one of the many family gatherings that followed, Richard's father stood to make a speech. "I made many mistakes," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "but I've been blessed with a second chance. Sarah, you've taught me what it means to truly love and support one another. Richard, you've shown me the strength of standing by your convictions. I couldn't be prouder of the family we've become." As he raised his glass, the room erupted into applause. The lesson learned. Sarah and Richard's journey had not been without its challenges, but their love had proven to be a force strong enough to overcome even the most formidable obstacles. They had fought for their love, and in doing so, they had created a life filled with joy, purpose, and unity. Thank you for watching until the end. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel.